Hey there everyone, welcome to today's video, and also welcome to my first film review. I've never done a particular video like this before, but I figure I could give it a try since it's something new. For today's video, we are going to be talking about Ty West's 2022 film, Pearl. And I gotta say, I love this film so much. I only watched it one time, but I have so much to discuss with you guys about it. But before we continue, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. I really appreciate you tuning into my content, and I really hope that you stick along with me for the rest of the journey. And also, two little things here. Since I'm going to be discussing certain elements about this film, like including plotline, there are major spoilers ahead. And this film will have sensitive content, so for other viewers, be on the lookout that there is a trigger warning for this video. So I figure we begin with a little bit of background about Pearl. Pearl is, as it turns out, it's the second film of a series known as the X film series. And I can't really pinpoint exactly what kind of franchise it is, because as you watch each of these films in order, you'll notice that they carry some kind of different genre. Like the first film in the series, X, it's portrayed as a typical slasher movie set in the 1970s. And we got Pearl, the movie we're talking about today. It is portrayed as a psychological horror film, and the newly released entry into the franchise, Maxine, I haven't watched it yet, but I have read it's portrayed more as a crime drama film with elements of horror. I want to check that out, but staying on topic, we are going to be talking about the middle entry, Pearl. What I find very interesting about Pearl is that it's one of those movies that you can't really help but sympathize with the main character who evolves into a villainous role. And I know, we usually go for the hero of the story. But Pearl is the main character, and as you'll come to find out, Pearl, the character, she is the main antagonist, aka the bad guy, of X, the film set in the 1970s. In X, Pearl is portrayed as this elderly woman who is jealous of a group of young filmmakers who come onto her farm and opt to make an adult movie. And yet she and her husband Howard, they take out the entire group one by one, jealous of their youth and of their sexuality. And it becomes quite apparent that in the movie X, Pearl is really resentful about what she missed out on in her youth, because what she craved in her youth is stardom, freedom, and to be loved by the world, which is exactly the main focus for her standalone movie, Pearl. And Pearl in itself is a prequel to the original installment. The film Pearl is set in 1918 Texas. We have a young Pearl in her 20s. She lives on her family's farm, and it's really painted as like this dreamscape kind of place where everything is colorful and peaceful seemingly, and it gives like this combination of like the Wizard of Oz and Little House on the Prairie kind of atmosphere. Like the first 5 minutes are aesthetically beautiful. It's almost as if we're being led into a movie that was filmed in early Hollywood era, like maybe the 1920s to the 1940s. Even the cinematography and the film style for the opening credits, they are painted as if they were made back then, even though it's a modern movie that was shot 2 years ago. Now, Pearl our main protagonist, she is, dancing around in her room wearing one of her mother's fancy dresses from her own youth. And she's in her head dancing around, longing for the admiration of a large audience that is awaiting her. Yet her mom comes in and she is disturbed that Pearl is wearing one of her dresses, and she asks her to go feed the animals in their barn, which she immediately does. It's at this point where the audience is beginning to see a different side of Pearl if they haven't seen the original X movie, not understanding her character. Pearl is just happily feeding the animals, and she's talking to them as if they're the only audience that she has so far, saying things like, "One day the whole world's gonna know my name." And I guess one could argue that she has her head in the clouds kind of moment, but hey, one can dream, can't they? And so all of a sudden, there's this goose that flies into the barn, and this is where it gets really interesting. Menacingly, Pearl walks up to the goose, and she has a pitchfork in hand, and for a lot of people who know a lot about horror movies, you know what she's going to do with that pitchfork. She's just aiming it and... And so Pearl carries the now dead goose to the edge of a lake, and she calls out the name Theta, which is an alligator approaching the dock that she's standing on. And she actually feeds this duck or goose to the alligator. Like, she happily does it. I gotta tell you, when I first watched this movie, I was like, okay. So all in all, the first 5 minutes of the movie give us an idea of what the entire film's atmosphere is truly going to be like. It is deceptively happy and peaceful, yet it's got some dark undertones that will surface here and there throughout the movie. So remember how I mentioned that Pearl in the movie X has a husband named Howard? Well, here in the prequel, Howard isn't seen until the very end of the movie. He, at this time, is serving in World War I, and Pearl is just awaiting his return, looking at newspapers, wondering when he'd come home, always looking out for him. And at the same time, Pearl is living with her dysfunctional family. She has a controlling mother and a disabled father who can't speak or move. They really have to help him, and Pearl is just pretty much one of the two caretakers for her father, and that's one of the things that you can't help but feel sympathetic for as an audience member, because we can relate to what family life can be like taking care of each other, especially with older parents. What really threw me off guard after the goose scene was one morning Pearl is riding into town. She's on her bike and she picks up her father's medicine, and then she goes to the movies to watch these early films about dancers. She is actually watching the very thing that she wants to become, that she so dreams for. And after she watches the film, she meets the projectionist, who is very friendly. He even encourages her that she will become a star after getting to know her. And before they part ways, he gives her a little clip of one of the films that she just watched, and she gleefully takes it. Now, on the way home, on her bike, she's just thinking about the encouragement she just received, when all of a sudden, the clip that the projectionist gave her flew out of her pocket, and she goes into this cornfield to find it. Whereupon she finds a scarecrow displayed high above the stalks. And here's where things get really weird, to say the least. For some reason, Pearl climbs up to the scarecrow, like face to face, and then she puts the scarecrow on the ground and starts dancing with it in a very dreamlike way, but also, And then when she drops the scarecrow on the ground, she briefly in her head sees the projectionist's head on the scarecrow and screams that she's married, but then she suddenly drops onto the scarecrow, and I won't go into detail. For those of you who have watched the movie, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And things go from crazy to crazier when at one point Pearl is visited by her sister-in-law Mitzi, who tells Pearl about an audition that is coming up at a local church in a few days. And after this conversation, Pearl feels like this is her chance to really get off the farm and find adventure and stardom in her life. So she spends like the rest of the film preparing for this moment. So after Pearl visits the projectionist again one night, she gets into this conversation with him where he tells her, you only get one shot at this life, and if you can't follow your dreams while you're still young, it might as well be too late. I'm thinking from a psychological standpoint, Pearl takes this the wrong way. Like, she gets the idea of what he's saying, but how she executes her plan to follow her dreams, it's pretty misguided. And I'll tell you why. Because the next day, she rolls her dad out of the house and to the edge of the lake where the alligator usually rests. And we as the audience can't help but fear for the father, because she talks to her dad as if he's a burden for her. And she's whispering into his ear, this is no way to live. But before her father can be gator bait, Pearl's mother walks up from behind and asks, what is she doing? Then the scene changes to where Pearl finds one of Theta, the alligator, one of Theta's eggs, and carries it back to the barn. And she puts it onto a loft of hay. It looks as if she's going to care for a baby alligator. But no, immediately after she starts feeling this surge of anger, thinking back on what her mother has put her through, she goes back up to the egg in the loft. From intense anger mounting up in her mind, she crushes the egg while thinking about her husband Howard blowing up randomly. And that's where the second half of the movie really takes flight, showing a huge shift in not only for Pearl's character development, but also for her psychological downward spiral. So that night, Pearl and her family, they are eating dinner together, and this dinner conversation is what brings things to a boiling point. She finally tells her mother that she's going for a dance audition, and her mother rejects her, saying that Pearl would be abandoning her family if she went out and danced just for vanity or anything like that, when in fact from Pearl's standpoint, she is just trying to achieve a dream of trying to be a star. And this is what Pearl is trying to defend against her mother. But when Pearl tells her mother that she has no idea what she's capable of, her mother counters, saying that she's seen the things that she did in private, and based on how Pearl's increasingly erratic behavior has been blossoming, she assumes it would only be a matter of time before she hurts someone else. Then all of a sudden things get heated and they have like a brief scuffle. At one point, Pearl tells her mother, I just don't want to end up like you is all, implying that she doesn't want to be the kind of housewife and farm girl who would just take care of things at home and never have a chance to really live life. And Pearl's mother reacts by smacking her daughter against the face, at which point, Pearl screams at her mother, "I hate you," and she slaps her back. But they get into this little fight, and while they're shouting at each other, Pearl accidentally pushes her mother into the lit fireplace, setting her ablaze. And Pearl tries to put her mother out by throwing hot boiling corn water on her, leaving her barely alive, but also tried to put out the fire. Keep that in mind, because this is a complex situation, isn't it? But for some reason, Pearl carries her mother to the basement, and she just leaves her there overnight. She leaves her father just sitting at the kitchen table, completely immobile and helpless, and just rushes back to the projectionist, where she wordlessly spends the night with him. And so the next morning, it is the day of the audition, and Pearl tells the projectionist that she has to practice, and so he politely gives her a ride back to her house. And so when they arrive home, Pearl finds her father still sitting at the table and tells him that she'll clean him up later, and they have a guest. And so right at this point, the projectionist is starting to feel uneasy about Pearl. Like there's more to her that he did not think there would be to her, if that makes sense. He's starting to see Pearl's unhinged side, because he hears this sound coming from the basement, which is her mother still down there trying to get out. And Pearl just tells him that it's their dog, who presumably caused a mess in the house and had to put the dog in the basement. And so they're out at the barn. Pearl's just introducing the projectionist to their animals and what she named them after. She named her farm animals after known actors and actresses of the 1910s. And so at one point, the projectionist asks, "Well, what about your dog?" And she looks back at him with a smile and says, "Oh, we don't have a dog." "Yeah, but we thought that you had a dog, according to what you just told the projectionist." So he's gingerly trying to get away from her, wishing her good luck at the audition, and Pearl's just all of a sudden feeling uneasy, saying, "Did I do something wrong? Why are you leaving me here? I don't understand. I thought you liked me." And she starts screaming in his face about it, to the point where she's basically scaring him away. And by the time he gets to his car, Pearl's just waiting there with a pitchfork saying, "I'm not staying on this farm." She stabs him with the pitchfork twice while he's in the car, actually. And she's just screaming at him the whole time, saying, "Nobody's gonna keep me on this farm. Not you, not my mom, not Howard, not anyone." And she finishes him off with a stab to the face. Now, I'm gonna backtrack a little bit here with my personal thoughts. It's right here at this moment in the film where I know that something is drastically going to happen, because when I first watched this movie, I had no idea that there was actually a movie that came before this, even though it takes place later in time. Pearl is the movie that I started watching, and now I'm interested in watching X. But now that I know that Pearl has lived on that farm for like many, many years, I could see that at this point in the story, she's not going to get what she wants. Because if she stayed on that farm, there's a chance that she may not have won the audition. And my assumption at that point was correct, because after she smothers her own father, that's right, she smothers her own father with a pillowcase to put him out of his misery, if you want to look at it like that. She goes to the church immediately afterward, ready to audition, and she gives like this flamboyant performance, dancing. Now, if you watch the movie closely, you'll notice that in this scene, there is a dance number going on with other dancers, but the sequence is played out as if it's in her head. In reality, it's just Pearl with no background, no fellow dancers. It's just her giving the performance of her life. And when she's done, with a smile and all, she is rejected. And so she's crying immediately. Like the next 2 or 3 minutes, it was hard for me to watch. Like, I'll go ahead and tell you right now. She's just screaming and crying at the judges going, "I'm a star!" Believe me, if you watch the movie, you got to hear Mia Goth's acting right there. Like, she is superb in this role. So when her sister-in-law, Mitzi, from earlier in the film, when Mitzi takes Pearl home, they have like this very deep conversation, which Pearl dominates with an approximately 8-minute long monologue, giving her thought process over every single thing that she feels like is wrong with her and about her desires and wishes. She goes on to talk about how she goes from resenting Howard for leaving her on the farm while he goes to serve in the war. She reveals to the audience that she originally was pregnant with their baby but suffered a miscarriage. Yet she reveals also that she was happy when the baby died, because according to her, she didn't know how to care for another life. Then she goes on to reveal about her affair with the projectionist, and going even further with the murderous things that she did, revealing that she killed her mother and the projectionist, saying that they were, quote, meaningful in the act, but when she killed her dad, he didn't deserve it, again, according to her. And yet the monologue just goes on and on and on. Like, it's impressive. It's almost like almost the entire thing is taken in one shot, and Mia Goth, she really crushed it, showing emotion and all, memorizing a bunch of lines. Again, just watch it for yourselves. You'll know what I'm talking about after you see the film yourselves. And when her monologue concludes with, "I can do better. I will make this farm a good home for me and Howard. I will do everything that it takes as long as you stay here with me and love me." It's at this point where Mitzi is at a complete loss for words. She's sitting across the table from Pearl, and she responds, after all that, she responds with, "I think I better go." Now, Mitzi has the right idea here. After hearing all of those confessions, wouldn't one logically believe that the person you're sitting across could be possibly psychotic at the least? And then Pearl's just staring at her cold in the eye and asking if she'll tell anyone about what she revealed. In which Mitzi is just telling her no, something that Pearl would probably want to hear. And then finally, when Mitzi gets out of the house, Pearl follows close behind her, and she picks up an axe and starts chasing after her, and Mitzi's just running away in this slow-paced run, the slowest paced run that I've ever seen. I'm sorry, but it is. And so she's wearing heels and she trips. And of course she hurts her leg, and she's just staggering up to the point where Pearl catches up to her and chops at her back 3 times. And when she's on the ground, Mitzi looks up at an axe-wielding Pearl, screaming and crying, "Please, I'll do anything you want." And Pearl delivers a chilling line that reflects what her mother said to her earlier in the film, but now she's saying it in a colder way. She says, "It's not about what I want anymore, Mitzi. It's about making the best of what I have." And then, of course, Pearl finishes her off. I don't know about you guys, but Mitzi really didn't deserve that. It's like every one of the kills in this movie has some kind of connection with Pearl's psychosis or just her life in general. So it's at this part of the movie where it ends on a highly disturbing note. It's the most disturbing part of the movie, so keep in mind there are going to be spoilers, but I just can't stomach the fact that Pearl would dismember her sister-in-law and then feed each piece to the alligator in the lake. And yet she goes to her now deceased mother in the basement, takes her up, combs her hair, gets her ready for a family dinner, and rolls her now deceased father to the dinner table. And she sets up the table with this gross looking pig that has been sitting on their front porch for days, maybe even a week. It is so rotten. I don't think I can even show a picture of it here on the video, so I'm gonna skip that. It's at this point where Pearl is just fully accepting that she's not going to be a star, but she does have a home and she does have a husband out there waiting for her, so she's doing what she thinks is best for her life and just keeping her family together. You know, that's when the screen cuts to black and we get to the very last scene. The final sequence of this movie is what arguably makes this film kind of iconic. At this point in the movie, Howard is returning home from the war, unaware of the carnage that has happened in the plot line. And so he arrives gleefully, trying to find Pearl. He walks into the house, and yet he finds at the kitchen table her deceased parents and the rotting food that's set on the table. And he's taken aback by what the scene looks like in front of him. Till finally, Pearl calls to him from the hallway, and she's holding this pitcher of lemonade, and she just says to him with a smile, "I'm so happy you're home." And Howard's just looking at her, still disturbed. The end credits just roll over a 2-minute long, non-cut frame of Pearl's face. It's like stylistically, the film is ending on a happy note from an early film, but yet as the seconds go by and as the music becomes more and more unnerving, Pearl's face goes from a steady, happy smile to a pained, forced smile with tears running down her face as if she's looking psychotically at somebody. And that somebody would be us, the audience. And so the film closes with a slow close-in on her face, sort of like a closing eye kind of view. And so that is what happens in Pearl. So what I found interesting about Pearl is, despite the violent scenes that are depicted in various parts of the movie, it does nonetheless connect with the audience one way or another. I mean, think about it. This film gives like a modern audience a deeper scope into mental health, and especially women's mental health. It goes on to really depict how being trapped in isolation, like Pearl just being trapped on her family farm for the rest of her life, being isolated can be very impactful on one's mental health. And it also talks about the concept of escapism. What do we do when we're isolated and we have big dreams and we want to achieve them? Trying to escape the daily struggles that we as human beings go through in our day-to-day lives. We all want to find that kind of catharsis in our lives where, you know, once in a while you want to go out and enjoy a night on the town after a long week of work. In Pearl's case, she just wanted to achieve something in her life that really meant the world to her, but the way she carried it out had disastrous results. A lot of comments I've seen about this film is that some viewers look at Pearl as if she's an anti-hero for going up against the people who kept her isolated. Now here's where I might want to tweak my opinion on it. I see Pearl not as an anti-hero, but as a villainous protagonist. The difference between an anti-hero and a villainous protagonist is an anti-hero has the qualities of someone who is depicted as heroic, but they don't do it in a conventional way. kind of like how vigilantes are seen taking down bad guys, but not through the confines of the law, like police officers or military soldiers. Think of it like Batman being a vigilante. He fights crime, he just doesn't work with the police. He does it on his own terms. That is more like closer to an anti-hero, even though, for full disclosure, Batman is a superhero. Now, a villainous protagonist is someone who is portrayed more like a tragic character. Originally, you really want to root for this main character, but this main character displays qualities that would be considered very questionable, both morally and ethically. And even though you wouldn't agree with the methods of how they execute their goals, in the end, somehow we want them to win. So that's what I see Pearl as. Now, I don't condone the murders in this movie, not at all. I do, however, find it very cathartic that she, in a way, tried her very best to audition for a dance position, and eventually, in a twisted way, she accepted who she is, and in a bittersweet way, she just made peace with it. And that's where the end of this movie really sets up the events for X. That's why I think Pearl is looked upon as a modern masterpiece, because it gives a lot of us something to relate to. Like, for one thing, and I didn't mention this earlier, the film is set in 1918 during the Spanish flu pandemic. And a lot of us can relate to what it's been like to live through the COVID-19 pandemic, going out in public wearing masks and being careful socially. Yeah, when you watch the movie, you'll notice that's what's going on when Pearl goes into town and whatnot. And we all don't want to deal with people who keep us from our dreams, even though we know that the pressures of social life are inevitable for us to hinder our dreams. And so my final thoughts on this movie, I definitely give it like a 9 out of 10. I give it a 9 out of 10, and I highly recommend it to anyone out there who would be interested in horror movies, psychological movies, drama movies, you name it. But again, I want to point out, and I cannot stress this enough, the movie is very sensitive with stuff like this, meaning that it does have a lot of violence and it does have some nudity. So be mindful when watching this movie, because it all depends on one's sensitivity. But conceptually, it's a very interesting movie when you look past the blood and the sexuality parts. For the record, I am not a licensed psychologist or anything like that, but it is fun to think about what kind of personality type or mental disorder Pearl has. Some would argue that she has narcissistic tendencies. Others would say that she has borderline personality disorder, which could also be a strong possibility. And there are even others who would say that she could be on the autism spectrum. And as a person on the spectrum myself, I could see one or two traits from that theory, because for one thing, she does like to wear like the same farm girl outfit almost every day, but it could be argued that that could be all she had to wear back during the time period. And she has these like repetitive actions, like feeding things to Theta the alligator. But I digress. All of these are just theories, but it is fun to think about in a way. So I'm gonna end today's video here. If you liked my little review of Pearl, please let me know. And if you want me to do another review of any other film, I will happily do so. I will consider taking this idea into a whole new direction, and I could review more movies. Again, thank you all for joining me today, and I'll see you later, alligators. Yes, pun intended. Have a great day, everybody.